Yes, all the research that's been done in the last few months seems to give credibility to that claim that indeed Iran is trying to continue on its nuclear program. How successful that's been, we don't know, and I think it would be very difficult for Iran to get back to where they were pre the pre the 12-day bombardment that they suffered. Nevertheless, as you quite rightly said, that there's going to be further talks. But the thing that's been consistent, which is quite unusual for Donald Trump and his administration in all this, is the actual deliberate consistency in which he has continuously stated the four red lines that the US administration want to impose on Iran. And those four red lines and demands have been clear. The first one is stop uranium enrichment. The second is non-production of ballistic missiles. The third is stop arming and funding their proxies. And the fourth is to stop the clampdown, the violent clampdown on the domestic protesters. Unusually for Trump, he has been totally consistent with those demands, and his administration, whether it's through Vance or Rubio, continuously support that. Now, I don't see that the Iranians have any room for to be flexible on this. And given the consistency of Trump's demands, I don't think Trump will back down on this. So it's truly up to the Iranians to show a great degree of flexibility should they wish to avoid military conflict, which, as we all know, the Trump administration have been building up their military hardware in the area for weeks now. I don't think Trump can climb down from not using his military unless the Iranians give in to his demands.
And is it realistic to believe a nuclear deal remains achievable when both sides express such deeply contrasting positions?
And no, I don't think it is, because one thing is for sure, that the Trump administration do not trust the Iranians. And of course, vice versa is true as well. So, and the Iranians have very little room for maneuver simply because they are the weakest they've ever been, politically, militarily, domestically, for nearly 50 years now. So I think the onus is really on the Iranians, should they wish to avoid conflict, to be as flexible as they can and give in to some of Trump's demands, which will be very unpalatable for them, but nevertheless, if they wish to avoid military conflict, they will have to do that.
And does the shadow of potential military escalation strengthen or weaken prospects for a diplomatic agreement on Iran's nuclear program?
Well, again, as I have suggested, I think it will strengthen the prospects for a diplomatic solution only if the Iranians bow to Trump's demands. He's got a gun to their head and they have very little room for maneuver. So depending on how strong the Iranians want to retain power will determine how flexible they are during this current round of negotiations. I'm very, very pessimistic about this because I think the Iranians will try and resist as much as they possibly can Trump's demands, and Trump has given them, I think you suggested 10 to 15 days. I think that time frame is probably more like 8 to 10 days now from the time he first mentioned it.
Thank you, Peter, but don't go too far as we'll be back with you very shortly. Germany's Foreign Minister Johann Wadephal has said Iran must engage in talks with the United States to stop supporting armed proxies like Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon and the Houthis in Yemen. Speaking alongside his Belgian counterpart Maxime Prevot, emphasised Germany's special responsibility for Israel's security. Meanwhile, Iran's President Massoud expressed hope for a positive outcome from the upcoming nuclear talks with the US as a delegation heads to Geneva for the third round of discussions. Listen in.
Wenn Teheran die Lage nüchtern analysiert, dann sollte es erkennen, dass es in diesen 3 Bereichen auf die USA zugehen sollte. Das ist auch die Erwartung Europas, denn auch wir werden dadurch bedroht. Es muss die Unterstützung von Hamas, Hezbollah und Houthis aufgeben. Und das sage ich insbesondere als deutscher Außenminister, der eine besondere Verantwortung für die Sicherheit des Staates Israel hat. Das sind Punkte, die wir seit längerem der iranischen Regierung vortragen und wo wir bisher zu wenig Kompromissbereitschaft erkannt haben. Ich hoffe, dass Teheran jetzt erkennt, dass es an der Zeit ist, hier Zugeständnisse zu machen und endlich eine konstruktivere Rolle in der Weltgemeinschaft einzunehmen.
We are now being joined back by Peter Baum. Thank you for joining us back here today. Can pressuring Iran to cut ties with groups like Hamas realistically advance peace efforts in the Middle East?
Yes, it can. And what we're seeing here, Ellie, is a united front from the members of the European Union supporting one of Trump's 4 demands that Iran stop arming and supporting their proxies, in this case Hezbollah. Now, very recently, the Israelis have been taking out weapons depots in Lebanon where Hezbollah are still relatively strong, and they had remarkable success just a couple of days ago, what they would consider to be a remarkable success, when they eliminated, I think, 10 of Hezbollah's top commanders in Lebanon in what was obviously a targeted strike from which they received intelligence from their sources in Lebanon. Now, with the Germans making such strong demands from Iran, this again will pressure the Iranians further to cede to one of Trump's red lines, which is stop arming their proxies. Further pressure being brought on them by members of the European Union, Germany being a very important country within that union, obviously. So, and Lebanon themselves are actually trying to disarm Hezbollah, although at the moment the Lebanese army doesn't have the competencies or the manpower, perhaps not even the political will, to do the job that Trump and Israel would like them to do. But nevertheless, they have been somewhat successful this year than they and the end of last year than they had been since the 1980s when Hezbollah were formed. So Hezbollah themselves, being one of Iran's main proxies, are themselves now facing increased pressure, not only domestically, but outside of Lebanon, internationally. And this will hopefully bring Iran to their senses to understand that they can no longer rely on what was formerly very strong military support from one of their proxies to help them in any conflict against Israel, who will certainly be brought into the war if Trump decides to attack.
Thank you so much, Peter Baum, for joining us here today on NewsX. Well, thank you. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio reaffirmed that the war in Ukraine does not have a military solution. He He emphasised that only negotiations could end the conflict, positioning Washington as the essential mediator. Rubio's comments came after the Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, following a phone call with US President Donald Trump, said Kyiv expects trilateral talks in March to pave the way for a leaders' meeting. Rubio also highlighted the US's ongoing efforts to pressure Moscow, including additional sanctions on Russia's oil company and continued arms sales to Ukraine. Regardless of the diplomatic push, Rubio made it clear that President Trump's patience is not infinite and expressed frustration with the prolonged war, calling it completely stupid and senseless. However, he reiterated the US commitment to working towards a peaceful resolution and asserted that only through negotiations could a long-term solution be reached. Meanwhile, both sides continue to prepare for the next round of talks with hopes to finalise a leaders' meeting in the near future. Let's listen in to what the US Secretary of State had to say.
This afternoon, in order to have the third round of our talks with the US team. And we have made some progress last time. We were able to find some sort of understandings. And I think based on those understandings, we can build something in the form of an agreement, a deal.
We are now being joined by retired Major General Sadakaji, who is a senior geopolitical and strategic defence expert. Thank you so much for joining us here on NewsX World. Does advocating negotiations risk undercutting military support for Ukraine, or is it a realistic recognition of the conflict's limits?
Good afternoon, Ellie. Thank you for inviting me for your show. Two components. One is the land estate under occupation by Russia, and second is the military aid to Ukraine. Be stopped or should be continued. My take on the whole issue is that if the peace process has to come to some kind of a tangible and substantive end state close to a ceasefire, a lasting ceasefire and lasting peace, then scaling down the expectations or demands from relevant stakeholders by the process of give and take should be an acceptable norm and practice. So if the military aid is being expected to be cut down to Ukraine, Russia also should be expected to cut down its activities of dominance along the eastern flank, that is the Donbas region. So therefore, to answer your question, I would recommend that a process of give and take, a negotiated stance should be expected. But while it is desirable, but is it feasible on ground? That's what the whole issue is. For that, one has to go back in time and analyze the historical triggers. That was the primary reason as to why Russia invaded. Unless we address the core issues, the conflict will continue unabated and maybe eternally. Thus, to bring this mindless conflict to an end, a serious and sincere effort has to go in. What Marco Rubio is saying as a political decision, what it means is that the concessions have to be made by both the sides, for which Zelensky has gone a great deal in scaling down his demands and his expectations. Maybe it will not be inappropriate to expect similar kind of scaling down or compromises to be made by Russia. Back to you, Eddie.
And can peace talks gain traction if both sides still remain far apart on the issues like territory, security guarantees and post-war arrangements? Are they just going to keep going back and forwards?
Absolutely. Short, the cryptic answer to your question is no. No headway can be made. This traction that you are talking of, I would actually put it this way, that some beginning has been made. And when you make a very noble and high-end objective in a conflict zone, one would expect that the process of negotiation would go through very significant milestones of denial, resistance, reconciliation, adaptation, finally acceptance. I think a long journey has been covered in a short time, wherein the demands have been scaled down. However, Russia should be very mindful of the compromises being made by Ukraine. While Ukraine is expected to understand the compulsions of Russia, Russia should also be made to understand the imperatives on which the Ukraine is expected, because ceding 20% of land will question the very validity of rules-based order in 21st century, that is the sovereign integrity and the territorial integrity. Therefore, is Russia prepared to accept a new norm or new normal, which is expected from Ukraine to become a kind of a rule of law? Well, if that is yes, then I don't think we are on a path to make any tangible progress. So therefore, the traction must continue, and no matter how much time it takes, this endeavor on part of Donald Trump and his team, I'm sure they are on a very progressive and forward-looking path for a lasting peace. Back to you, Ellie.
Thank you, Major General Stakhaji, but don't go anywhere as we will join back with you in just a moment. Let's listen in to what the US Secretary of State had to say.
As an example, the president levied additional sanctions late last year on the oil company, Rosneft. The administration continues to sell weaponry to Ukraine. We don't sell weapons to Russia, and we don't sanction Ukraine. The president values the fact that he is the only global leader that has any chance in the world of bringing these two sides together to a negotiating table. We're the only country or only entity on the planet that's been able to achieve having Russian negotiators and Ukrainian negotiators sit at the table and talk to one another. So we don't want to walk away from that. We know that at the end, the war in Ukraine does not have a military solution. That war will be settled through a negotiation. And right now, we are the only country in the world that can be a catalyst for negotiation. If we forfeit that role, no one else can do it. That said, do I believe the president's patience is infinite? I do not. But I'm not going to forecast for you when that runs out or at what point he decides not to do it any longer. I could tell you, and I think you've heard him express, a deep frustration that this has not come to an end because he sees it as a completely stupid and senseless war.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has stated that both Russia and China should be included in any future nuclear arms control agreement. Let's listen in to what he has to say in his statement.
So we believe, the president strongly believes, that for any sort of agreement on nuclear agreement in the 21st century to be legitimate, it has to involve these three countries, the United States, Russia, and China. And we're going to continue to explore their willingness to do so. They have publicly said they're not willing to do it. I'm sure you've heard them say that. I'm sure they've reiterated, and I know they restated that again very recently. But we'll continue to press on it because we think it would be good for the world if we could reach such an agreement. The president would be in favor of that if we could do it, but it has to be all.
In addition, Rubio has also touched upon China's rapidly increasing nuclear stockpiles, stating that while China may claim to be far behind the US and Russia in terms of arsenal size, they have the capacity to close the gap easily. Moreover, Rubio has discussed the current state of US-China relations, saying that both countries have reached a point of strategic stability, avoiding a full-blown global trade war. We're now being rejoined by retired Major General Stakhaji. Thank you for joining us back here. How does the expiry of the New START treaty between the US and Russia shape the urgency and complexity of creating a 21st century arms control deal that also accounts for China's growing nuclear state?
Yeah, great question. In 21st century, one would ideally expect the planet Earth to be free of any nuclear warhead. But that is not the case. The reality is China is going by leaps and bounds and expanding its nuclear arsenal and going in for very, I would say, potentially very dangerous weapon systems, particularly when it has developed the hypersonic glide vehicles, which can take the warhead. No radar system or surveillance system in the world available today, they may be able to detect, but they cannot intercept. So there is a huge danger. And second thing is that in its nuclear test site in Lochner, it is given to be believed that they have the weapon systems in mated condition. So under the circumstances, when the New START doctrine or agreement has expired on 5th of February or 6th of February this year, it is very, very extremely volatile and dangerous to have a world without any safety mechanism or monitoring mechanism and mechanism of checks and balances to prevent any nuclear holocaust. Therefore, the urgency, this is answer to the first part of your question. Second part about China being included in the agreement. Well, I would say that yes, the stance is very positive and legitimate. The expectations are also legitimate by USA. But is China going to come under pressure and toe the line? I don't think so. Because China has got, rather I would say, far too many leverages in its favor. It can weaponize the rare earth elements. It can weaponize many other issues and technology, particularly critical minerals and technology. And it will start putting countervailing pressure against the USA. So therefore, I would recommend that it makes more sense to go in for a short-term, a medium-term and long-term kind of a goal. In the short term, it is advisable to go in for extension of the START agreement, which expired on 6th of February this year, maybe for 1 year or 2 years or some kind of a stipulated timeline. And with a caveat that all-out effort should go in to bring in not only China, but all the nuclear weapon states. There are 9 of them as of now, as on today. Apart from Russia, China and America, there are 6 more countries who also should be brought to the ambit. But even if it is not possible, at least the stated doctrine and a policy should outline an objective to bring everyone under the umbrella of a planet without the dangers of nuclear weapon and the kind of disaster we have had way back when the little boy and the fat man were dropped in 1945. Back to you, Ellie.
Thank you so much, Major General Stakhachi, for joining us here today on NewsX World. Thank you. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has said that there is no set deadline for holding elections in Venezuela and emphasizing the US has not established any artificial timeline for when voting should take place. Rubio has added that the interim Venezuelan president, Delcy Rodriguez, assumed power last month following the US removal of Nicolas Maduro from office. He also said that the country's ruling party-controlled legislature has since passed a limited amnesty law, which human rights groups say does not adequately free hundreds of political prisoners. Rubio has also stated that the country's ruling party-controlled legislature has since passed a limited amnesty law, which human rights groups say does not adequately free hundreds of political prisoners. Let's listen in to what Marco Rubio had to say.
Well, I don't know if we'd set an artificial timeline. The important part is just if you think about it logically, it's hard to have elections when many of the people that may want to participate in have been in jail or are still overseas. So I do think that as we enter this recovery phase, which we think I think we've done a pretty good job working with the interim authorities on the stabilization phase. You have not seen mass migration, you have not seen civil war, you have not seen violence. On the contrary, you've seen some real stability on the ground, and you've seen a growing in productivity among their key sectors. I think now you enter into this, we're increasingly entering into this phase of recovery, and part of that is a national reconciliation. So there have been very positive steps taken. Hundreds of political prisoners have been freed. The infamous prison El Agoida has been closed.
The FBI has subpoenaed phone records of Kash Patel and Susie Wiles, now the FBI Director and White House Chief of Staff, respectively. The actions took place during former President Joe Biden's administration in 2022 and 2023, while Special Counsel Jack Smith's probe was underway. Reports say that Jack Smith was investigating current President Donald Trump's handling of classified documents and possible interference with the 2020 election. Kash Patel claims that the subpoenas were an example of overreaching by government officials and a flimsy attempt to evade oversight. Moreover, Patel has contended that the records were filed in a way that made them difficult to locate once the FBI took over in 2025, and he criticised the FBI for not disclosing the seizure. Meanwhile, the FBI has not commented on the purpose of obtaining these records. Separately, a federal judge has ordered the Justice Department to keep Special Counsel Jack Smith's report on the classified documents in the investigation under seal, blocking its release to the public. The University of California has sold approximately $2 billion in general revenue bonds while facing ongoing pressure from the US. The funds from this bond sale will be used to finance or refinance various university projects. However, the sale comes amid a lawsuit from Trump administration, accusing the university system of discrimination against Jewish and Israeli employees at UCLA. This lawsuit follows previous attempts by Trump to freeze federal funding for the University of California, Los Angeles, due to pro-Palestinian protests, although these attempts were blocked by a judge. Despite these challenges, the University of California's system continues to monitor federal actions regarding higher education. Last year, other universities like Harvard also issued bonds to protect against funding uncertainty. Furthermore, the University of California receives over $17 billion annually in federal support, which highlights the financial importance of resolving these ongoing disputes. That's all we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world.
In the midst of death, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists.
Hello and welcome, I'm Ellie Richardson and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of this hour. Iran and the US hold the latest rounds of talks in Geneva today aimed at resolving their long-standing nuclear dispute and averting new US strikes on Iran following a large-scale military build-up The two countries renewed negotiations this month, hoping to tackle a decades-long standoff over Tehran's nuclear program. Cuban forces killed 4 people and wounded 6 others aboard a Florida-registered speedboat that entered Cuban waters on Wednesday and opened fire on a Cuban patrol, the Cuban government said at a time of heightened tensions with the United States. The United States has eased an oil embargo on Cuba, but Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the communist-run island must change dramatically, saying it is only itself to blame for an economic crisis. Former US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton is to testify behind closed doors today before a congressional committee investigating the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein and his accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell. Former President Bill Clinton is scheduled to answer questions the following day. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said that he and US President Donald Trump agreed that the next session of trilateral talks in March on a war settlement should lead to a meeting of the leaders for the country's leaders. Jimmy Lai, the jailed pro-democracy tycoon, won an appeal overturning his 2022 fraud conviction. The Court of Appeal quashed the conviction, but Lai remains in jail. The death toll from the heavy rains in Brazil's southeastern state of Minas Gerais has risen to 46. Flooding and landslides displaced around 3,600 people in the cities of Juiz de Fora and Uba, while 21 people remain missing. The US is blocking the Venezuelan government from paying for Nicolas Maduro's legal representation in the drug trafficking case he faces in New York. Maduro and his wife Sila Flores both pleaded not guilty to drug trafficking charges. And for your top story this hour, tensions between the US and Iran continue to escalate as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio warns that Iran's refusal to discuss its ballistic missile program is a big problem. Rubio raised concerns over Tehran's missile capabilities, especially after US President Donald Trump accused Iran of pursuing rockets that could potentially reach the United States. This warning comes ahead of critical talks set to be discussed in Geneva, where discussions will focus on Iran's nuclear program. Meanwhile, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi arrived in Geneva, optimistic about reaching a diplomatic resolution. However, the US has ramped up pressure, announcing new sanctions targeting Iran's missile and petroleum activities. The situation remains tense, with both sides bracing for potential escalations. Let's listen in.
It's the president's preference to make progress on the diplomatic front. But it's also important to remember that Iran refuses to talk about the ballistic missiles, to us or to anyone, and that's a big problem.
We are now being joined by Adrian Calamel, who's a fellow Arabian Peninsula Institute and terrorism scholar, joining us from New York. Thank you for coming here today and speaking with us on NewsX World. Thank you, Adrian. How central is the issue of ballistic missiles to the broader US-Iran negotiations in Geneva? Oh. Sorry, I'm just going to repeat that. I'm not too sure if you can hear me. How central is the ballistic missiles to the broader US-Iran negotiations in Geneva? Tensions between the US and Iran continue to escalate as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio warns that Iran's refusal to discuss its ballistic missile program is a big problem. Rubio raised concerns over Tehran's missile capabilities, especially after US President Donald Trump accused. We are now being rejoined by Adrian. Thank you for joining us here, Adrian, and hopefully you can hear me. My first question to you is, how central is the issue of ballistic missiles to the broader US-Iran negotiations in Geneva? Tensions between the US and Iran continue to escalate as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio warns that Iran's refusal to discuss its ballistic missile program is a big problem. Rubio raised concerns over Tehran's missile capabilities, especially after US President Donald Trump accused Iran of pursuing rockets that could potentially reach the United States. The warning comes ahead of critical talks set to be discussed in Geneva, where discussions will focus on Iran's nuclear program. Meanwhile, Iran's Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi arrived in Geneva optimistic about reaching a diplomatic resolution. However, the US ramped up pressure, announcing new sanctions targeting Iran's missile and petroleum activities. The situation remains tense, with both sides bracing for potential escalations. Let's listen in.
Preference to make progress on the diplomatic front. But it's also important to remember that Iran refuses to talk about the ballistic missiles, to us or to anyone, and that's a big problem.
The US Treasury Department has imposed fresh sanctions on more than 30 individuals, companies and vessels tied to Iran's illicit oil trade and weapons program. The move targets a shadow fleet of tankers that Washington says carried sanctioned Iranian petroleum and petrochemicals. It is also hits networks that helped Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and Defense Ministry secure materials for ballistic missiles and other weapons. The sanctions come amid continued tensions over Iran's nuclear program and broad US pressure tactics. Treasury officials say Tehran has exploited global finance to sell illicit oil and fund military projects. We are now being rejoined by Adrian Calamel. Thank you, Adrian, for joining us here today on NewsX World. Now, we've just heard that the US Treasury has imposed fresh sanctions on more than 30 individual and companies and who are linked to Iran, and saying that they are funding Iran's military projects. How correct is that, do you think?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show, and good morning to you, Ellie. I would say, I haven't seen the names yet, but it's well known that the regime operates a ghost fleet of ships, of tankers, and the basic trade, and part of it's been taken offline with Venezuela. That was part of the network. It is a ghost fleet that goes from Iran to China. That's probably who's being targeted here right now, but it's hard to say. In the grand scheme, as far as policy vis-a-vis the Islamic Republic, it's just ratcheting up the pressure a little bit, but it's not going to move the needle any which way.
And with these accusations and to these companies, how could it affect them? How could it affect all of these individuals, their companies, that are now having imposed sanctions on them?
Well, we have to remember that if you look at the regime's economy, 80% of it's controlled by the IRGC. So when you sanction these companies, you're hitting the IRGC, and a big part of Trump's policies when he's been putting in the sanctions back in 2018, the maximum pressure campaign. This is a continuation of that program, of that policy. It's been targeted at regime officials who are cutouts, who operate ghost fleets, networks that move illicit oil, and that oil is moved back, and that money that they get for that oil is pushed back, let's say, for rocket fuel that they're getting from China. So that's how they're paying to pay up for the ballistic rocket fuel shortage that they experienced after the 12-day war. So I would say this is targeting the IRGC. As far as the people are concerned, it doesn't affect them because they're still living at the bottom.
Thank you, Adrian. Please don't go too far, as we will be back with you very shortly. In a developing incident on February the 25th, Cuban forces reportedly killed 4 people and wounded 6 others, all of whom were aboard a Florida-registered speedboat that entered Cuban waters and opened fire on a Cuban patrol. According to the Cuban government, the group aboard the boat consisted of anti-government Cubans, and some of them were even previously wanted in Cuba. They came from the United States, allegedly armed with assault rifles, handguns, homemade explosives, ballistic vests, and telescopic sights. The Cuban Interior Ministry has confirmed that an additional Cuban suspect was also detained in connection with the plot. According to initial statements collected from the detainees, the authorities have stated that the group's intention was to infiltrate Cuba for terrorist purposes. The wounded individuals were evacuated and are currently receiving medical care. Among the casualties, was identified as Michael Ortega Casanova, while the other 3 remain unnamed. Now, let's move to reactions from US officials. US Vice President J.D. Vance has expressed the situation, acknowledging that it is being closely monitored. Meanwhile, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has provided an update, confirming that the Department of Homeland Security and Coast Guards are involved in the investigation. Let's listen in to their statements.
So on the second thing, Marco briefed me about 15 minutes ago on it, but we don't know a whole lot of details, and so I'll defer to the White House to provide more updates as we get them. Certainly, a situation that we're monitoring. Hopefully, it's not as bad as we fear it could be, but can't say more because I just don't know more.
As it stands now, the Department of Homeland Security, the Coast Guard, others are involved. The majority of the information we still possess is what Cuban authorities are providing, both the public and the U.S. government. We have our embassy on the ground in Havana working this as we speak, asking for access to the people that were on those vessels, if they were American citizens or permanent residents. According to the Cuban regime, that the boat was registered in Florida. We're tracking that down. We will know shortly, and we will know quickly, many more facts about this incident than we know right now. The majority of the facts being publicly reported are those by the information provided by the Cubans. We will verify that independently, and as we gather more information, then we'll be prepared to respond accordingly.
Moreover, in Florida, Attorney General James Athmir has ordered state prosecutors to open a separate investigation into the incident, expressing skepticism and the Cuban government's account. We're now being joined by Dr. Satoru Nagao, who's a fellow Hudson Institute, joining us from Hudson, Washington. Thank you so much for joining us here today on NewsX World. What are the potential diplomatic and security ramifications as for US-Cuba relations, especially given the current climate of sanctions geopolitical tension and historical mistrust between the two countries?
But this is important because for a long time, Cuba is a major country to register U.S. influence in the Caribbean Sea and in the American continent. So that's why the Cuba's intelligence connection or the Cuba's security person's presence in this region is one of the threats against the U.S. hegemony in this American continent. But now the Cuba-Venezuela agreement has disrupted. Indeed, Cuba does not have money to buy oil, but in this case, Cuba can provide a security person or the medical staff. So that's why the Venezuela provide oil. It was a deal between two countries, and so that's why Cuba can survive. But now Venezuela was fallen, and Cuba lost a partner to deal, the barter-based deal. So that's why Cuba faced a crisis, and Cuba tried to rely on the Mexico, but Mexico also cannot help the Cuba. So that's why the just current oil sanctions is very severe for Cuba's economy. And so now the people need to, people face a very serious shortage of the energy. Only some hours per day they can get electronic power. So that's why without Cuba follow the United States, it is very decisive for Cuba. And revolution or something could happen in the long run.
And what broader questions does this incident raise about broader security, maritime law, and the risks of non-state or irregular actors engaging in armed movements across international waters?
Indeed, this economic sanction is very tough because anyway, the source of the oil is Venezuela. And now Venezuela will not export oil to Cuba. So that's why the blockade itself could happen, but that is not so tight. But anyway, the source of this oil has already closed. And there is no other country to provide the oil instead of Venezuela, because providing the oil means that this is challenging against the United States. And so it is a clear challenge, means that the U.S. will react against these countries. Of course, the tariff is one of the things, but other things also could happen. So that's why it is not easy to do. And geographically, this is the area of the United States, very close proximity and relatively easy to deploy. So that's why countries around Cuba cannot ignore this America's intervention's possibility. So that's why this sanction is very strong now.
Thank you, Dr. Satoru Nagao, for joining us here today on NewsX World. Thank you. Tensions over Cuba's worsening crisis escalated as US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has stated that Cuba must change drastically to curb mass immigration and improve living conditions. Rubio has blamed the communist leadership for policies that have left the island vulnerable to an energy crisis and worsening humanitarian conditions. Rubio also warned that the US could reinstate restrictions on Venezuelan oil imports to Cuba if Havana violates the spirit of recent US sanctions easing. This highlights Washington's determination to maintain pressure on Cuba even as the US Treasury allows limited sales of Venezuelan oil to Cuba's private sector, excluding government and military entities. However, regardless of these measures, Cuba continues to face severe energy shortages and economic hardship, with power cuts and soaring costs intensifying migration. Meanwhile, regional leaders and humanitarian organisations urge dialogue and assistance to address the deepening crisis, but the US remains firm in its stance, increasing pressure on Cuba's government. We're now being rejoined by Adrian Calamel, who is a fellow Arabian Peninsula Institute and terrorism scholar. Thank you for joining us back here, Adrian, on NewsX World. Does linking potential retightened oil sanctions to Cuba's behaviour risk punishing ordinary citizens, or is it necessary diplomatic lever?
If it's done correctly, it's absolutely a diplomatic lever that can be used. And the Trump administration, I think, has been very mindful, as I stated out with the Islamic Republic and how they levy sanctions. And then, as Dr. Nagao rightly pointed out, this is, there is oil going into the country, but it's only going in the private sector. It's just how is it monitored? So it's a little, a little bit fog of sanctions, fog of war. I mean, this is a conflict, a cold conflict, sometimes turning a little hot at times, especially Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs type scenarios, and it's only 90 miles off the coast of America. So yes, Venezuela coming offline, that really impacts Cuba. Now all they have for support is China's important for them. Cuba's important for the Chinese. They basically took an old Russian spy base, revamped it, and they're using it as a forward operating spy base 90 miles off the coast. And then it's also been, there's been visits by top officials such as Mohsen Rezai of the Islamic Republic in Cuba right around 2022. So that could change with Venezuela situation, because Iran was part of that illicit oil network, and they now it just may be two-way trade between Iran and China. Is it going to hurt the people? I really hope not, but at the end of the day, it's this government that's been really hurting this people for decades upon decades. And Marco Rubio knows best, since his family fled Cuba. So, we'll see what happens. I'm generally not in favor of sanctions, because a lot of times they just hurt the people, or they're not effective because they're just not enforced. I hope that we are going about it the right way this time around.
Thank you so much, Adrian, for joining us here today on NewsX World. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hong Kong's Court of Appeal has overturned Jimmy Lei's fraud conviction. The ruling came today, just days after Lei was sentenced on separate national security charges. Lai, a prominent pro-democracy media tycoon, had been convicted in December 2022 for breaching lease terms at Apple Daily's headquarters. He concealed the operation of a private company in the building. The court's chief judge, Jeremy Poon, quashed the conviction and set aside the sentence. Lei, who remains in jail, did not attend the hearing. Along with Lei, another defendant, Wong Wei-kyung, had his sentence overturned. We're now being rejoined by Dr. Satoru Nagao. Thank you so much for joining us back here today on NewsX World. Does the quashing of a fraud conviction unrelated to political charges change the narrative around political prosecutions in Hong Kong, or does it underscore deeper systemic issues that, given that Lei's core national security conviction still stands?
Anyway, for China, the Jimmy Lai is the symbol of the resistance against the Chinese government. And under the Chinese government rule, resistance itself is a serious crime. And so they believe they must punish him as a symbol of this kind of resistance and show the people what kind of cost the resistance will pay. So that's why in this case, even if his claim is going through in some part, but the final result of these cases could be very serious for him, because the punishment itself is the purpose of this decision in the court. So anyway, serious punishment will come and show the China's China's brutality and.
The physics was known for quite a while.
Hello and welcome. I'm Rashan Gidwani and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the headlines for this hour. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi receives the Speaker of the Knesset Medal in Tel Aviv, following a historic address to the Israeli parliament. The visit reaffirms a robust strategic alliance as both nations initiate final talks for a comprehensive free trade agreement. A U.S. Air Force C-146 Wolfhound sustains significant damage after hitting a concrete barrier during a roadway landing exercise in Pangasinan. 5 personnel are injured in the accident, which marks the first attempted highway landing operation in the Philippines. Cuban forces kill 4 individuals and wound 6 others aboard a Florida-registered speedboat after a deadly exchange of fire near Cayo Falcones. Secretary of State Marco Rubio denies U.S. government involvement but warns Havana of serious ramifications. Ahead of PM Mark Carney's upcoming visit to Delhi, Canadian authorities have suddenly begun softening their allegations of transnational repression against India. Sources in Ottawa suggest a strategic reset is underway to repair trade relations critical to the Canadian economy. A federal judge rules the Trump administration's third country deportation policy unlawful, citing violations of due process. The ruling temporarily halts the rapid removal of migrants to nations other than their own, pending a government appeal. Malaysian Foreign Minister Mohammed Hassan issues an urgent plea for diplomacy as nuclear talks resume in Geneva today. Kuala Lumpur warns that the increased U.S. naval presence in the Persian Gulf risks a global energy crisis and a total closure of the Strait of Hormuz. The International Monetary Fund releases a sharp directive calling on the Trump administration to aggressively reduce the U.S. fiscal deficit. The IMF warns that Washington's current spending path is driving an unsustainable trade gap that threatens the stability of the entire global financial system. Hong Kong's Court of Appeal overturns the 2022 fraud conviction and sentence of pro-democracy tycoon Jimmy Lai, ruling that the lower court erred in its judgment, while the 78-year-old remains in prison serving a separate 20-year national security sentence. The surprise ruling marks a significant legal victory for the defense. And here are the top stories for the hour. Russia launched missile and drone attacks on Ukraine overnight, hitting residential buildings and injuring around 20 people across the east and south. Missiles targeted Kyiv, Kharkiv, and the Kyiv region, while drones struck Zaporizhzhia. In Zaporizhzhia, 7 people were injured and several homes were damaged, leaving 500 without heating. Kharkiv saw at least 14 injuries, including a child. The attacks follow a pattern of targeting Ukraine's energy sector. The Zaporizhzhia region also houses Europe's largest nuclear power plant, which remains under Russian control. And now joining us is retired Major General Sudhakarji, senior geopolitical and strategic defense expert. Joining us from Jaipur. Hi, sir. Thank you for joining us. How are you today?
Good afternoon, Roshan. Thank you so much for inviting me for your show.
Fantastic. So let's dive right in. Sir, there have been many injuries. All of this really points to the fact that Russia is not stopping anytime soon. What do you make of this latest involvement as far as Russia and Ukraine is concerned?
It's a vicious cycle, Roshan, because once the conflict is on, it is very difficult to pinpoint what was the initial trigger. You see, a couple of hours back, it was Russia which was, Ukraine was bombing the Russian establishments. There were casualties. And be mindful of the fact of the Operation Spiderweb, which took place about a year back, close to 1 year back, almost 4,500 kilometers deep inside Russia, and bombing of 40 strategic bombers, aircrafts, with the help of drones. You know, those kind of disastrous kind of operations have been unleashed by Ukraine. So it is no point actually blaming either of the stakeholders or the warring factions. The issue here is that at the moment, there is a very serious and sincere effort going on towards some kind of a lasting peace between two warring nations, and whether it will meet the light at the end of the tunnel or not is anybody's guess. The time will tell. But I think the time has come wherein some kind of a restraint has to be exercised, both by Russia as also Ukraine. And when you go in for the lasting peace, to make some beginning, looking at it from the military perspective, I would say all guns must freeze. The barrels must be actually mothballed, no firing on either side. That's the only way. And both the parties, warring parties, they must fall back to respective sides by a couple of kilometers, or imaginary line should be regulated and monitored by a neutral party, and then the peace process should start. You know, going ahead with the peace process with this ding-dong battle going on from either side is actually going to inflict lots of damage to innocent civilians, which is just you have explained in your question. This will go on endlessly without any sight for any kind of peace in times ahead. Back to you, Roshan.
Yes, it is a vicious cycle indeed. Please, sir, stay with us. We'll be right back with you. French President Emmanuel Macron will update France's nuclear doctrine, ruling out shared European control, but outlining what France can offer allies concerned about the U.S. nuclear umbrella under President Trump. While France and Britain are nuclear powers, most of Europe relies on the U.S. for deterrence. Recently, Germany raised discussions on a European nuclear deterrent. Macron has emphasized that France will maintain its exclusive control over its nuclear weapons and wants European partners to understand its doctrine. The update comes amid growing concerns over Russia's nuclear threat and a shifting global security landscape. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz has visited Beijing, calling for a reset in trade relations with China. During his meetings with President Xi Jinping, Merz expressed his desire to deepen the comprehensive strategic partnership between Germany and China, Germany's largest trading partner last year. Merz, accompanied by a large business delegation, also addressed Germany's growing trade deficit with China, which has increased fourfold since 2020. Meanwhile, the German Chancellor highlighted China's economic challenges, such as manufacturing overcapacity and market-distorting policies, while calling for fairer trade practices. China's leadership, in response, promised to support multilateralism and free trade, encouraging German companies to invest in China. The visit came amid strengthening European engagement with China, particularly after a rift with the U.S. under President Donald Trump. Furthermore, MERS had also discussed the Ukraine crisis and urged China to use its influence to promote peace. Regardless of these economic and political challenges, both sides have reaffirmed their commitment to dialogue and strategic cooperation with a focus on green transitions, automotive industry, and emerging technologies. Now joining us again is retired Major General Sudhakar Ji, senior geopolitical and strategic defense expert, joining us from Jaipur. Now, sir, from what we understand, China and Germany are essentially strengthening their ties. Do you foresee in the future that the U.S. will impose tariffs upon China, doing more business with Germany, and what will be the outcome of all of this?
Well, Roshan, brilliant question you have asked. Tariff issue, to my understanding, has been more than adequately addressed by the latest USA Supreme Court's verdict that any tariff over and above what is authorized to the President's executive power under the EIIP, that emergency powers of the President, will be illegal, and it is illegal. So to impose or to visualize that Donald Trump is going to impose tariff on China because Germany is getting closer and trying to deepen its trade relations with China, well, I have my doubts. He will think twice. Donald Trump will think twice before doing it. But what he can do is, there are many other issues like the critical technology when you talk of. Take your mind back to 2023, the whole warfare of the trade and the technology transfer started by USA way back in 2023, and Netherlands was asked to stop providing the lithograph machine for the semiconductors. This is one such machine without which no semiconductor industry in the world can produce the wafer, silicon wafers. And on that, you, with the help of lithography, you actually code and plant those codes on the wafer for necessary outcome and the expected product, the result. So that with that beginning, the China at that point in time started twisting the tail, weaponized the rare earth element, so much so that some of the rare earth elements and the critical technologies without which neither F-35 can fly, nor Tesla can move, nor the data centers will have any light to function. So it is called duninium, if I recall correctly. Similarly, you have germanium and gallium, without which no cell, the solar cells can be produced, nor your graphite blocks, which is dominated essentially more than 90% of the dominance is by China world over. So it's going to be again a kind of a brickbat kind of a thing going on from either of the sides. It's not going to take anywhere. So subsequently, what is going to happen, that the geoeconomics, which is dominating the world order today, will gradually gravitate towards China. That is going to be more dangerous than the tariff which Trump is trying to impose. So diplomacy and dialogue will go a long way in actually having a negotiated stance for a healthy and a prosperous kind of a world order in future. Back to you, Roshan.
Yeah, absolutely. I already do think that China has dominated the world market, especially in EV manufacturing. I know for a fact that Mercedes-Benz reported a drop in earnings as far as automotive development. Do you believe that this is also why that this partnership is happening right now in China, that maybe both parties can find a way to essentially strengthen ties, not only for diplomacy, but also for automotive manufacturing in Germany?
Yeah, but that's a brilliant point. I agree with your observation. However, let me qualify by saying that the present world order is going through a huge geopolitical churn because of multiple factors. We can't say it started with pandemic. I think it started with one single factor, that is the lack of trust in the world order today. That has been the central factor, because of which neither the North nor the South nor East or West, none of the components or stakeholders in the world order today are trusting, and therefore the transatlantic relationship, based on which the global apex organizations are actually, the architecture is based on they have virtually become defunct. So much so the World Trade Organization, which was established at the behest of the United States of America way back in 1997, that also has been aground. It has become defunct as of now. So under these circumstances, and over and above that, Donald Trump 2.0 has come out with a very noble idea of using tariff as the best way to actually, restore its status quo of supremacy in the global economy. With a debt of $38 trillion, debt to GDP ratio having gone as high as 168%, USA is in deep trouble. So this is actually making it very, very vitiated, very complex to navigate, and as a result, the trust is actually compelling, lack of trust, compelling the very NATO allies to look for partners away from the transatlantic relationship. And with the Greenland issue having come to the forefront, it has actually shattered all kinds of connections and the relationship between the European Union and UK with that of country like USA, and forcing them to look for partners like China, where they already have well accomplished and established network of manufacturing, of automobile industry and host of other industries. And it is only just about resetting the ties which will give them a momentum to carry forward the productivity of all their establishment in China. And they run a very huge deficit, trade deficit of 90 billion euros as of 2025. It may actually contribute towards the reduction of this trade deficit. That is in case of Germany. And also Germany being the powerhouse, the economic powerhouse of Europe, would be actually setting a trend and become kind of a precedent for all other countries to make their the orientation towards China, because that is the manufacturing base which willingly or unknowingly we outsourced to China for past 30-40 years, and it is going to be nearly impossible to diversify and de-risk as we have contemplated, and going in for China plus one. It's a long order which time will tell us which direction we are heading to.
Thank you so much, sir. I do like your description of this partnership momentum. We'll chat again soon. Thank you. Next up, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has announced the strengthening of defense, trade, and counter-terrorism ties with Israel during a historic visit, which is the first in 9 years. Israel has been a long-time arms supplier to India, and the two countries now collaborate on joint manufacturing of defense equipment such as drones and missiles. While specifics of the defense deal remain private, the government officials have focused on broader bilateral ties and also securing a deeper defense agreement. Additionally, India and Israel are also working on a maritime and land corridor connecting India to the port of Haifa, which experts say is a move that will open new routes to Europe. This initiative, part of the India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, is expected to improve relations between Israel and Arab nations, with Israel's Haifa port playing a crucial role. And now joining us is retired Major General Gigi Dwivedi, war veteran and professor of international relations and strategic studies, joining us from New Delhi. Now, sir, this move is fantastic for Modi and Israel. Of course, they're developing a new economic corridor, but my main concern and question is, will India isolate itself from the rest of the Middle East and the other Arab countries?
Well, Roshan, first and foremost, we need to understand that India and Israel relations are time-tested, and this have been developed over more than half a century. And India has stopped hyphenating itself from the Arab world, or weighing the relations between Israel and Palestine as two different, I would say, spectrums. So therefore, I think India is following a very nuanced and a policy which takes care of the interest. And it is not a zero-sum game that we are cooperating with Israel at the cost of Palestinian or other Arab state. That's not the case. So therefore, I think we need to take this in the larger perspective that India has a deep-rooted interest in Israel. India has deep-rooted interest in the Middle East region per se, and we have cordial relation with the Gulf countries, with Iran, with Egypt, and also with Israel, and we have never abandoned our support for Palestine. So therefore, when you look at this development of our relation with Israel, they are at the multiple spectrum. Of course, political relations are very important. We also have now the trade agreement is coming up, and you talked about the connectivity, because this connectivity, that is India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, well, this was during the last G20 meeting, this was mooted, and this is very important because you see the sea lines of communication, they can be disrupted through the Suez Canal at times. So this gives an alternate route to the Europe, and also gives us the strategic space to have better connectivity through Israel and through Middle East, as also through the Europe corridor. And another important point is the defense relations, because India has a deep-rooted defense relation with Israel, and they have been time-tested. In fact, India accounts for 34% of the Israelis' defense export. And now this relationship is being taken forward from purely transactional or purchase, relationship to the joint manufacturing, joint development. And there are a number of major agreements that are coming in during this meeting. And if you ask me a further question, I can elaborate on those defense agreements that are on the anvil. Roshan.
That's all we have time for right now, sir, but we'll chat with you again shortly. Thank you. Now, next up, a Thai political party that came second in this month's vote filed a criminal complaint against the nation's election commissioners, accusing them of violating election laws. The Reformist People's Party Deputy Party Leader Weo Asawa Rungruang has said that the Reformist People's Party submitted a case to a criminal court against seven election commissioners, the Election Commission's Secretary General, and another election official. Weo has added that 2 charges involve wrongful exercise of duties, and the last charge, we claimed, was about marking ballots with QR codes and barcodes which allow the votes to be traced and not kept secret as it should be. Meanwhile, the Election Commission has confirmed the victory of caretaker Prime Minister Anutin Charnvirakul's conservative Bumja Thai party, ratifying most of the vote results. Next up, Dr. Congo government forces have launched an attack on M23 rebels in the east, using drones to strike a key mining site. The conflict is centered around Rubaya, where M23 rebels have occupied the coltan-rich mine since April 2024, with help from Rwanda. The fighting intensified as local militias captured Kazinga and clashes spread to South Kivu. Despite Angola's ceasefire proposal and France's calls for peace, hostilities continue. M23 has set up a parallel administration in Rubaya, further complicating the conflict. Local residents are terrified, and the death toll from the drone strike remains unclear due to disrupted communication. And now joining us is retired Major General Gigi Dwivedi, war veteran and professor of international relations and strategic studies, joining us again from New Delhi. Sir, what do you make of this incident in Rwanda and how these parties will essentially work together in the future and essentially dissolve these disputes as well?
Well, Roshan, we need to understand the background of this whole issue. In Congo, there are rebel groups. What you said, AFC, is the alliance of the rebel groups who are rebelling against the government. And this M23 is the March 23 movement. Basically, this is the contest for the mineral-rich, region of Kivu, and especially the Zubaya mines. Now, these rebel groups restructured again in 2021, and therefore these clashes have been taking place between the government forces, that is the DRM's Democratic Republic of Congo, and between the AFC, that is the Rebel Alliance, and the M23, the March 23 movement. Now, these clashes have been going on for quite some time, and there is another force behind this, that is Rwanda. The Rwanda army, almost 3,000 to 4,000 troops, are supporting these rebels. And as I said, the major contest is for the rich mines of Dubaya, which produced a very important mineral, which is key to the electronics and the laptop manufacturing. Now, lately, the Congo forces have taken this counteroffensive, and they are used the drones and also the other weapon systems to suppress this AFC and M23 rebels together. Now, this is exactly what the fighting going on. Of course, there have been effort to bring in peace, even by the US and also the other neighboring countries, but that are not rectified. And this clashes have flared up lately because the rebels are duly supported by the Rwandan forces, and that's why they are able to sustain a fight against the government forces of Congo. Roshan.
Yes, of course, you mentioned this coltan-rich mine and, of course, this mineral that helps laptop manufacturing. Is this mineral being exported out of Rubaya? And if so, how do the exporters and the trade administrations essentially lock down on what's happening in Rubaya and stop all this conflict?
Yes, absolutely, because Rubaya mines produce about 30% of the coltan material, and that is the major export earning of Congo. And this is why the contest is between the rebels and the Congo forces, because they want to control this mineral-rich area. And the government agencies, of course, are involved because they directly ensure or they directly oversee the exports, but also there is another market that is being controlled by the rebel forces, and that's where they generate the money to sustain these rebellion and the insurgents activities. And of course, Rwanda also gets a share of it. So there are two sides. One is the government side, which is involved in the official trade, and on the other side are the rebel groups, which also do the shadow trading in these very important minerals from Rubaya and Kivu mineral belt. Roshan.
Thank you so much, sir. We'll chat again soon. That's all we have time for. Keep watching NewsX World for more news updates from around the world.
In the midst of death, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists.
Hello and welcome. I'm Ellie Richardson and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top headlines of this hour. Iran and the US hold the latest round of talks in Geneva today, aimed at resolving their long-standing nuclear dispute and averting new US strikes on Iran following a large-scale military build-up. The two countries renewed negotiations this month, hoping to tackle a decades-long standoff over Tehran's nuclear program. Cuban forces.
The physics was known for quite a while, and so that I think it hasn't really changed our understanding the quantum world work.
Job with the James Webb Space Telescope was to look as far back in time as we could to see the universe as it was young.
Changing the basic attitude about what education is for and what it needs to be.
Biology, medical studies, they make great progress.
What we can do as the Interparliamentary Union to strengthen democracy, to promote human rights, to ensure that humanitarian law is respected.
UN Security Council needs a makeover, a comprehensive reform, and India deserves a position there, a role there.
Prime Minister Modi during Operation Sindoor made it amply clear that war has never been India's choice. We are with the side of peace. We are neither neutral nor indifferent. We are with peace.
We would have dealt with the US a whole lot on trade and those kinds of things, and that's not as certain these days. So we have to go back and look at our European partners, our Asian partners.
An opportunity to exchange, to have a dialogue, to have a debate on a different perspective on finding the solution of the conflict.
First thing that is important to have a common ground, and that we do have with humanitarian laws and human rights, but also to say, okay, what does it mean for us as a country to act on these laws and how can we work together?
When we realize that there's something wrong with democracy, the institutions and policies, values come together and we take stock, and it's possible then to improve and chart a new course for democracy.
It's the people's right to self-determination, and if they want to be independent, they should be independent. We will not start a war against Greenland.
In the midst of death, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists.
The physics was known for quite a while, and so that I think it hasn't really changed our understanding the quantum world work.
Job with the James Webb Space Telescope was to look as far back in time as we could to see the universe as it was young.
Changing the basic attitude about what education is for and what it needs to be.
Biology, medical studies, they make great progress.
What we
Welcome to Nobel Laureates. I'm Ellie Richardson. This is the show where we sit down with the world's most brilliant minds, recipients of the highest honour in science, to discuss the ideas and breakthroughs shaping our future. Today, we're honoured to welcome a pioneer in the field of microscopy, Nobel laureate Professor Eric Betzig. Professor Betzig was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2014 for his development of super-resolved fluorescent microscopy, a technique that revealed the unseen world inside living cells. Professor Betzig, welcome to NewsX World. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. My first question for you is, before your work, scientists believed there was a hard limit to how clearly we could see inside cells using light microscopes. In simple terms, what changed and why was breaking that limit such a moment for science?
Well, for 400 years, microscopy has been the main tool by which we look at living things below the level of the naked eye. And it was learned around 150 years ago that there is a limit based on the wavelength of light to how small you could see. That limit is about 100 times bigger than the molecules which make up cells. And so what my technique, PALM, and others like it did is find loopholes in that physical law to allow us to get closer to the molecular level. In PALM in particular, the way it works is it takes the molecules that you want to see in the sample and one puts a tag on them, a glowing tag. And the tag can be turned on and off with light at will. And normally the problem isn't so much being able to see or detect a single molecule. It's that in the normal microscope, they look like big fuzzy blobs. And if you have lots of molecules, which is what you have in a cell, they all overlap and they make a smush. And so what PALM does is it turns on the molecules just a few at a time so that they're likely separated by more than the size of their fuzzy balls in the normal microscope. And you can point to the center of a fuzzy blob with much better precision than the diameter of the fuzzy blob. So in other words, you can figure out the location of those few molecules. You turn those off, turn another subset of molecules on, and repeat thousands of times until sort of point by point, like doing a painting by pointillism, you build up an image of the sample at near molecular resolution instead of the old limits.
You developed a method called photo-activated localization microscopy, or PALM. For viewers who aren't scientists, how could you describe what this technique does and why it allows us to see details inside living cells that were once invisible?
So I essentially just answered that. The technique I described is PALM. So again, it's by localizing or finding the location of individual molecules in a cell. It's important because essentially you can think of a cell as a city. And every cell in your body has about 20 million protein molecules in the same way that, I don't know, Mumbai or something might have 20 million people. And it's the interactions between all of those molecules that take us from non-living to living. And the ability to actually watch those interactions at the individual level gives us a lot of insight into how cells work, in the same way that being able to watch the traffic patterns or how people go to work in a city can tell you a lot about how a city lives, functions, creates things of value.
Your technology lets researchers watch proteins move and interact inside living cells. Why is seeing these processes in real time so important for understanding diseases like cancer or Alzheimer's?
Yeah, so again, you know, everything fundamentally comes down to we are large collections of molecules, okay? And everything that we are, and everything all the way up to the entire biosphere, is about levels of emergence where dissimilar things interact against one another. And even at the fundamental level, it's really random inside of a cell how they bounce around. But because of sort of the law of large numbers, half the time you get heads, half the time you get tails, even though it's random on the individual level, when they work collectively together, they end up becoming deterministic, and therefore you end up getting things like cells being able to divide or stuff like that. And it's all about what's happening at the single cell level, at the single molecule level. Now, that being said, many diseases come to changes in individual protein molecules. For example, there's a childhood cancer that's due to a little tiny section of amino acids, which is through a mutation grafted onto a protein, which is responsible for creating RNA, which is responsible for creating DNA, which is responsible for creating different things in the cell. And that little graft makes it so that it overproduces certain proteins. And so one of the things that one of my collaborators did is found a way to snip off that mutation and be able to recover what was going on. Now, the way we could see this, its effect at the single molecule level, was by palm, and to see that that little handle on the protein was causing the molecule to be overly sticky in its interactions, so it would end up leading to too much proteins. And so by clipping it off, it recovered the natural level of proteins, and then the cancer phenotype. This isn't in people, this is in cells in a dish. The normal phenotypes were recovered. That's so important that it led us actually to found a company called Icon Therapeutics, where we use single molecule tracking as a screen to find drug candidates to cure different diseases.
You later developed lattice light sheet microscopy, which allows scientists to capture incredibly detailed 3D images without damaging living cells. How does this method protect cells while still giving us such sharp images?
Yeah, this one's a little harder to describe, but as you can imagine, every organism works in 3 dimensions. We aren't in a flatland. Yet the microscopes we use to observe them are only in focus in one plane at a time. So if you start to look at a large organism, when you're looking deep inside a transparent organism, you're seeing a lot of out of focus light from the regions above and below in the sample. That's the way normal microscopes work for years and years, and people have just had to live with this out of focus light. The other problem with the out of focus light is, besides being fuzzy and not very valuable, you're still throwing light through the entirety of the specimen, and so you're killing it, damaging it because of the light over time. So what light sheet microscopy does is, instead of having the light come from a lens that's from above looking down on the sample, it takes a second lens from the side to create a sheet of light which only illuminates the one plane that's in focus from the lens looking from the top. And then what it does is it scans that plane by plane up through the organism and develops a 3-dimensional picture. So that alone reduces the amount of damage and bleaching to the cell that is happening, because you're not illuminating the whole cell at once, only the one plane that really has high information. But in addition, it turns out that the old microscopes would work by focusing the light to a point, and that point is then driven around point by point to get an image. There's 2 disadvantages to that. One is it's slow to go point by point, and the other is that it means you have to have very intense light at that point. And it turns out that not only is light bad, but light gets far worse if it's more intense. It doesn't go linearly. So if I double the dose, my damage to the sample might increase by a factor of 8. And so you want to keep the peak power low, and you want to spread it out over the entirety of the plane. And lattice light sheet microscopy in particular uses some tricks of physics to create an especially thin sheet of light, which makes light sheet even better. In fact, it makes it that light sheet is so thin that you actually improve the resolution in that vertical direction compared to normal microscopes. And because you illuminate a whole plane at once, instead of a point like in the old microscopes, it's very fast. You use a camera, you snap one plane, you move up, 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 and you can do that potentially tens or 100 times a second. So now all of a sudden you don't have a single 3D snapshot of your organism. You have a 4-dimensional movie of this three-dimensional dynamics happening everywhere inside of that organism. And you can do it for long periods of time because you've reduced the amount of damage you're doing to the cell tremendously.
One of the challenges in microscopy is that intense light can harm cells. How did your innovations help solve that problem, and what new discoveries became possible because of it?
Yeah, so again, it relates to what I just answered, is the keys are, first off, to make sure that in a three-dimensional organism, because a microscope only has one plane that's in focus at a time, the light sheets can find the light to that plane so that there's no damage elsewhere. The other thing that was less well appreciated was that the damage that you get in a cell is not strictly proportional to the intensity of the light. It goes as some high multiple of the intensity of the light. So that the more you can keep the light intensity down and still get the light out that you need to get your information, the better off you are. And so that was a bit of a surprise, but it was very, very effective. And in terms of what light sheet in general has done is, in some ways, I believe that light sheet microscopes in general, and lattice light sheet microscopy in particular, are probably far more important for biology today than the Palm technique that won me the Nobel. It's certainly true that lattice light sheet is the invention I'm proudest to have done. And it has personally, for me, revealed the beauty of living systems in a detail that nobody's ever seen before. I mean, I felt for the first few years after developing that microscope like I was Galileo. I was the only guy to have a good telescope, and everywhere, every specimen I pointed it at, we were seeing new things. In particular, for example, how immune cells attach themselves to cancer cells and how they destroy other cells, and seeing that in detail, and seeing this thing that looks like a lamprey eel come up and attach to another cell and then blow up that cell. And all of these processes that, the problem is that biologists historically have used tools that are not imaging based. They've used things like biochemistry, molecular biology, like understanding DNA and so forth, and structural biology, like freezing a cell, slicing it in little bits and throwing it into an electron microscope. So they're what I call reductionists. It's like trying to understand a car by taking it down to its parts and looking at the parts. But you'll never be able to understand how a car engine works from a random pile of engine parts. And so what microscopy in general and live cell lattice light sheet does in particular allows us to look at these parts as the engine is running, and to go in and look at the cylinders and look at the piston rings and do whatever, all in a living system. So much of biology that you read in textbooks is really just hypotheses. You think on the basis of some biochemical experiment that this protein goes here and does this and attaches here. And you can go on YouTube and find many simulations of how things work inside of the cell. They're all caricatures. They're as close to reality as Mickey Mouse is to a real mouse. And it's because that they have only worked from incomplete information, and so their imagination has to fill in the gaps. Lattice light sheet and tools like this allow us to observe directly what's going on and don't rely us to use our imperfect imagination to understand how cells work.
Scientists now combine different types of microscopes in what's known as correlative microscopy. Why is it valuable to look at the same cell in more than one way, and what extra insight does that provide?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It's true that every microscope has its own what's called contrast, how it gets information out of the cell. And it's the same thing, like if you could only see in black and white, you'd be limited in some ways in where you could learn. If you could only listen to sound in a small section of frequencies, you'd be limited in what you can learn. It's the same thing with microscopes, is that there are many, many, many ways to look at what's happening in a cell. There are proteins, there are There's different chemical factors that are used for signaling. There's the cytosol. There's many things that are happening inside of the cell, and every time we use any microscope, we're only looking at a small fraction of everything that is there. And different microscopes have different advantages. So as good as lattice light sheet microscopy is, it's still limited by that limit of 100 times bigger than a molecule. If we want to do better than that, we combine lattice light sheet with the palm technique, and then we can look at single molecules and three-dimensional organisms. If we want to do, but even there, we can only study molecules on which we've put a tag that can glow. That causes problems. So electron microscopes kill the cell, freeze the cell, slice the cell, but they can look at slices of the cell at much higher resolution of all features, not just the ones that have the labels on them, and get this sort of global contrast of where everything is. And then you can do, for example, palm correlatively with electron microscopy that tells you where the specific proteins you're most interested in for some disease, where they are located in relation. So it's kind of like electron microscopy gives you the whole Google map of all of the streets and stuff, and the palm will tell you exactly where the restaurants are that you want to go to. So those types of correlative things provide a lot more information than any individual technique alone.
Modern microscopes generate enormous amount of data over time, almost like filming a movie at the molecular level. How important are computers and artificial intelligence in helping scientists understand what they're seeing?
Yes, none of our microscopes would exist without computers. First, to automatically control all the widgetry inside of the microscope. It's like they're sort of the conductor of a symphony, when all sorts of parts inside of the microscope have to work together and play their notes at the right time. But much bigger than that is the fact that when you start imaging, you get lots of data. You know, in the old days, again, with biochemistry and stuff like that, you may get megabytes of information out. We get megabytes or millions of megabytes in a few hours from one of our microscopes. So it's a whole nother level. For audience people who know numbers, basically we take 4 million bytes of information every hour from one of our modern microscopes. And what that means is that pretty soon we end up having billions of megabytes of information stored on hard drives of data we've taken. Fortunately, the computer revolution has kept up with our ability to take that data. We also have developed tools to be able to take that data. It doesn't do any good to be just bits on a hard drive inside of a computer. You need to look at it. And so we've worked very hard with, again, modern GPU clusters and so forth. So as those millions and millions of megabytes are coming out in real time, they're processed. The images are processed. The fields of view are stitched together. Everything is put together in a nice, pretty package. But it's still on bits on a hard drive. The next step is then we want to visualize it. And so we end up using computer software to render three-dimensional views of this and then stitch together multiple frames of that to create three-dimensional movies. So that can be informative, but that is really where the Achilles heel of our technology is today, because humans were evolved to look in 2 dimensions plus time. And the data that we have on these hard drives is in 5 dimensions: X, Y, Z, time, and then all the different colors that represent different features inside of the organism. If you just put that on a computer screen, as you've seen, people can rotate around things in 3 dimensions. They can watch 3-dimensional movies. But at any instant in time when you're doing that, you're not really seeing the real 3D. You're seeing a projection, a 2-dimensional projection of a 3-dimensional object. All the things behind other things are hidden from you. And so you don't get the complete picture. And so we don't have complete information. And so there's 2 problems with this. The first is that as a result, because the data is so vast, there is just no way that humans can navigate, even if they could think in 5D, there's no way that humans could navigate that. It's a vast universe that is far beyond what your brain can easily comprehend. And then the other problem is that 5 dimensions is just not accessible to us as humans. And so what that has led to is, for years after developing the lattice light sheet, I would have dozens of groups come to my lab, get some data. They would all go back with big smiles on their faces, and they've seen things about the organisms they've studied for generations that they've never known before. The trouble is then they come back to us crying a month later because they have terabytes of data and they have no way of scalably taking all of that data and understanding it. So this is a long way of saying that the frontier forward is to be able to create minds that can think and see in 5 dimensions, to be able to extract the answers to any questions from this vast millions of megabytes of data. We ask through a large language model to the computer. The computer has developed a 5-dimensional vision model through artificial intelligence to be able to understand what is a molecule, what is a cell, what is this cell type, what is this process that's happening over here. Oh, that's cell division. Da, da, da. So we have to train AI to understand biology. Once it understands what we know about biology, then we can query it through a large language model and ask questions, and it will be our Sherpa to guide us through this universe inside of the organism to do this. This is nearly science fiction at this point. And I'm the last person in the world who ever wanted to get involved in AI, because historically, I try to move far, far away from what everybody else is doing, and everybody's doing AI. But I've concluded that this is the only possible path forward for us to be able to get understanding of the data that modern microscopes can produce.
Looking ahead, how close are we to being able to watch life unfold at the molecular level inside whole organisms, and what could that mean for the future of medicine?
So we do it already. So being able to look inside an organism and watch single molecule kinetics is something we do frequently. But again, when you're looking down at the molecular level in an organism, usually you don't have totality. You're not trying to look across the whole organism at once. You look at a subset of cells and you try to understand what's going on. What it means, though, is understanding single molecule kinetics, in my opinion, is the frontier of drug discovery. And like I said, we founded a company in 2018 to do exactly this. Not in whole organisms to begin with, but in single cells. And what you find is that, so basically what happens is we have a company, it's got 30 microscopes that basically produce a billion megabytes of data every day, and of the tracks of single molecules as they're moving in cells in hundreds of multi-well plates as different potential drug candidates are put in different wells, and see how they affect the kinetics. So we look at the phenotypes that happen under non-disease conditions. Then we look at the kinetics of what's happening under disease conditions. And the goal is to add different drug compounds and see if there are certain ones which end up recovering the native kinetics or motions of the molecules, even in the diseased cells. And so that has been transformative for our understanding in this company of how molecules interact with one another to do different essential processes inside of the cell. I would say that company has a far greater knowledge of protein-protein interactions than any entity on Earth. Now, whether that will translate in the end to accelerating drug discovery remains to be seen, but I'm pretty optimistic that and then eventually coupled with not just at the molecular level, but how these things then correlate to what happens at higher levels within the cell, from the organelles to single cells to collective motion of cells to the whole organism. If we can sort of gradually build up that, our knowledge of biology and our ability to discover drugs will literally grow exponentially.
Thank you, Professor Betzig, for sharing your insights and reflections on the extraordinary potential of modern microscopy and its impact on science and medicine. Thank you. This has been Nobel Laureates, where we bring you face-to-face with people pushing the limits of human knowledge. For more stories from the world's greatest minds, stay tuned to NewsX World.
In the midst of death, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists.
The physics was known for quite a while, and so that I think it hasn't really changed our understanding the quantum world work.
Our job with the James Webb Space Telescope was to look as far back in time as we could to see the universe as it was young.
Changing the basic attitude about what education is for and what it needs to be.
Biology, medical studies, they make great progress.
What we can do as the Interparliamentary Union to strengthen democracy, to promote human rights, to ensure that humanitarian law is respected.
UN Security Council needs a makeover, a comprehensive reforms, and India deserves a position there, a role there.
Prime Minister Modi during Operation Sindoor made it amply clear that war has never been India's choice. We are with the side of peace. We are neither neutral nor indifferent. We are with peace.
We would have dealt with the US a whole lot on trade and those kinds of things, and that's not as certain these days. So we have to go back and look at our European partners, our Asian partners.
An opportunity to exchange, to have a dialogue, to have a debate on a different perspective on finding the solution of the conflict.
First thing that is important to have a common ground, and that we do have with humanitarian laws and human rights, but also to say, okay, what does it mean for us as a country to act on these laws and how can we work together?
When we realize that there's something wrong with democracy, the institutions and policies, values come together and we take stock, and it's possible then to improve and chart a new course for democracy.
It's the people's right to self-determination, and if they want to be independent, they should be independent. We will not start a war against Greenland.
In the midst of this, life persists. In the midst of untruth, truth persists.
The physics was known for quite a while, and so that I think it hasn't really changed our understanding the quantum world work.
The job with the James Webb Space Telescope was to look as far back in time as we could to see the universe as it was young.
Hello and welcome. I'm Rashan Gidwani and you're watching the World Report on NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the headlines for this hour. Despite sweeping job creation pledges ahead of Nepal's March 5th national elections, thousands of young workers continue to depart daily for the Gulf and Southeast Asia. Following the violent Gen Z uprising in September 2025, new political alliances like the Rashtriya Swatantra Party are promising a strategic reset, but a stagnant domestic economy and 136 party fragmentation have left 18.9 million voters skeptical that any new government can replace the 1.2 billion monthly remittance lifeline. Russia officially questioned today how U.S. President Donald Trump's newly established Board of Peace will coexist with the UN Security Council. Kremlin officials argue the board, which Trump claims will bypass ineffective diplomatic channels to resolve global conflicts, lacks international legitimacy and threatens the established post-World War II global security order. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova labeled the fatal shootout off the Cuban coast an aggressive provocation by Washington intended to trigger a regional conflict. The Kremlin's intervention follows Cuba's claim that it acted in self-defense against armed infiltrators from Florida, further straining U.S.-Russia relations as Moscow reinforces its support for Havana. Ahead of PM Mark Carney's upcoming visit to Delhi, Canadian authorities have suddenly begun softening their allegations of transnational repression against India. Sources in Ottawa suggest a strategic reset is underway to repair trade relations critical to the Canadian economy. A federal judge rules the Trump administration's third country deportation policy unlawful, citing violations of due process. The ruling temporarily halts the rapid removal of migrants to nations other than their own, pending a government appeal. Malaysian Foreign Minister Mohammed Hassan issues an urgent plea for diplomacy as nuclear talks resume in Geneva today. Kuala Lumpur warns that the increased U.S. naval presence in the Persian Gulf risks a global energy crisis and a total closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Hong Kong's Court of Appeal overturns the 2022 fraud conviction and sentence of pro-democracy tycoon Jimmy Lai, ruling that the lower court erred in its judgment. While the 78-year-old remains in prison serving a separate 20-year national security sentence, the surprise ruling marks a significant legal victory for the defense. A U.S. Air Force C-146 Wolfhound sustained significant damage after hitting a concrete barrier during a roadway landing exercise in Pangasinan. 5 personnel are injured in the accident, which marks the first attempted highway landing operation in the Philippines. And here are the top stories for the hour. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian reiterated that Tehran is not seeking nuclear weapons, stressing that this policy is in line with the directives of the country's supreme leader. Pezeshkian made these comments ahead of upcoming